Okay, let me see if this is on. All right, I'm Don Mosely. I'm the Executive Director of Ralston House. A couple of things before we get started. One, anything you see on the PowerPoint you don't have to write down. I'll give you a copy of the PowerPoint when we're done, so don't worry about taking lots of notes. Two, we're going to talk about child sexual abuse and perpetrators. If something upsets you, you need to leave the room. That's fine. I'm not going to be insulted. People walk out while I speak all the time. So, and we're not going to be graphic. My point here isn't to shock you or do anything like that. So I'm not going to tell graphic stories, but the fact is it's an unpleasant subject, and there may be some kind of trigger for you. If it is, please, get up and leave the room. No hard feelings. With that said, I want to talk about what Ralston House is. We're the Child Advocacy Center for Jefferson County. And what a Child Advocacy Center is when there's an outcry of sexual abuse, physical abuse, or kids have witnessed violence, instead of police bringing those kids in to be interviewed into a police station or social services or the DA's office, they bring them to a place like Ralston House. And what we have, we offer a few services. We have forensic interviewing services. These are interviews that are done of kids who are suspected of being assaulted. So these are therapists, master's level. They're licensed here in the state. Then they go back east and are trained to be forensic interviewers. They have to receive an additional 40 hours of training every year. Plus, twice a month, our interviewers have to bring a copy of one of their interviews to be reviewed by other forensic interviewers. And the way these interviews are conducted is so that kids are not re-traumatized in the process. So no matter what police want us to find out, if a child starts to be re-traumatized during the interview, their ethics are to end the interview. We're not there to prove a police case. And we're a neutral party. We're not a government agency. We're a nonprofit just like you all are. And that's so that we're there to find out the truth. Not what the police want, not what the parents want, not what anyone in the community wants. And these interviews are recorded onto a DVD, every single interview. Because when the interview is done, police are going to take that DVD and they can watch that over and over. Social services will get a copy of it. DAs will get a copy of it. Defense lawyer will get a copy of it. And eventually it'll probably be shown in a courtroom. And that child doesn't have to be re-interviewed 5, 6, 7 times by each of those people. They'll have one comprehensive interview. They're also done in a way that is non-directive, non-leading, so they don't come in and say, tell us what your uncle did to you. They have to say, hi, I'm someone who talks to kids. Let's talk about your school. Get them to start, we try to train them to do narration, and then we move on in some way. It's sort of an amazing process to watch till a kid starts talking about some of the worst things that have happened in their life. Obviously, teens coming in know why they're there. The majority of younger children have no clue why they're coming into Ralston House. About 75% of the cases we see are sexual abuse cases. 10% are physical abuse, and 10 to 15% are physical abuse. And it's not a bruise on the arm, because police aren't going to interview a child over that. They can usually say there's a handprint, matches dad's handprint. What we see is child deaths. We're interviewing siblings in homes where child death has occurred, or long-term torture of a child, where we're having years and years of torture, and we're trying to get a child to talk about all of that. The other types of interviews we do are kids who've witnessed domestic violence. We're doing more of those. Burglary, homicide, attempted homicide, any kind of violent crime. They were started, though, for sex abuse because of the way sex abuse crimes were committed. Part of Ralston House, we have 2 locations, one in Arvada, one in Lakewood, is that they are really fun places to be at, really friendly, warm, because as you'll find out, kids who are sexually abused believe it's their fault. And they've a lot of times been told they're the ones who are going to be arrested. So the last thing we want them to do is go to a police station to be interviewed. Police who come into our place are not allowed to bring in uniforms. They lock their guns up so kids aren't seeing guns. So the whole environment is meant to make them safe. We're the only facility between Fort Collins and Colorado Springs that does pediatric sex assault examinations, except Children's Hospital and Denver Health and Hospitals. And we're the only non-hospital facility. We do those. We'll only find evidence in 10 or 15% of the cases. And if we find it more than that, physical evidence, we're probably doing something wrong. Our nurses making mistakes. Because perps of these type of crimes don't leave evidence. Partly because kids report so long afterwards, And partly because if it's your dad, a friend, a coach, your DNA is going to be all over that kid anyway. So we don't find evidence much. The reason we do the medical exams is, one, to make sure the child's okay. We do a full physical. If your mom or dad's the perpetrator, you don't go to the doctor. Because pediatricians at some point take you and say, you know, has anyone ever touched you here? They kick your parents out of the room. They talk to you in private. Perpetrators don't want that talk. So we've, one, diagnosed all sorts of other illnesses, everything from strep to worms to scoliosis that need to be operated on, all sorts of things. We test for STDs. People don't think about testing 4- and 5-year-olds for syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia when they're sick. Our nurse is going to test for those. Teens, every teen we've had in says, please test me for every STD, and please test if I'm pregnant, if they're a girl. Because they can't go to Planned Parenthood or their doctor because they all say, who's your partner? They don't want to talk about their teacher being their partner or their coach. So she's going to do all that kind of testing. And the main thing our medical does, I feel like, more than anything besides the health and maybe collecting some evidence, is it really is one of our first steps of mental health. Because kids and parents think their bodies are broken. They think this sexual assault, I can't go to the bathroom right. I won't be able to have sex when I grow up. I'm not going to be able to have babies. I won't enjoy sex. I won't go to college. It'll make me gay. It'll make me straight. And parents believe those same things as the kids. What our nurse can say that a social worker can't say as well is, your body's fine. In the last 500 exams we've done of kids, not one has had any permanent injury, physical, from the sex assault. Because these guys don't do it that way. That's not the kind of assault we're seeing. We'll talk about that later. But what she can do is say, look, your body works fine. You can have kids. You can enjoy sex. All the parts are there. We had an 8-year-old who played soccer who came in and thought she was pregnant for the last 10 months and said, the baby is going to fall out on the soccer field. I feel it moving around sometimes. I'm really afraid. She could say, 1, physically can't happen to you. I'm a nurse. I know these things. 2, we're going to test you. Look, didn't turn blue. You're not pregnant. And 3, your head can make you feel things in your stomach, and that does not mean you're a crazy person. And that means something different when it comes from a medical professional. So we do those exams. We have victim advocates who work with the families to help them figure out what the next steps are, and we'll follow them through the entire court process. Families, you know, if the dad's perpetrator, where are they going to live? What's the next steps? Are they going to arrest the guy that night? Are they going to arrest him tomorrow? What is this going to do to my family? My son's the perpetrator. Does that mean he's going to go to prison for the rest of his life? They're going to answer those questions. Questions like, how do I tell my mom that my brother's been having sex with my daughter? How do I break that to mom? What do I say to everyone at school who says, this is the best coach of all time, not so great to my son? Our victim advocates will help families start to figure that out, and their main emphasis is get those kids into mental health treatment. That will be their primary focus, and will follow as long as the family wants, including through the court process when the defense calls everybody in the family as a potential witness, and so the kid has nobody in the courtroom they know, except for the guy who gets to sit across from them and glare at them the whole time they're trying to testify. We'll put our victim advocates in there, and we'll say, look at us. Tell us the story. Tell your story to us, somebody you know. We also train DAs, police, and social services in Jefferson County around sex abuse, around new investigative techniques by bringing in outside experts, by bringing in webinars from across the country. And also, we run the multidisciplinary sex review team in Jefferson County, where we have DAs, police, social services, teachers, perpetrator therapists, victim therapists, medical personnel, all there, and we staff the worst sex abuse cases we see in the month with what other ways can we investigate, what else can we do here, how do we support the family, is this a pattern we're seeing? So that's what Ralston House does, sort of in a nutshell. And I want to talk about how we define sex abuse. It's this. Sex abuse includes all acts that are performed for the perpetrator's sexual gratification. And if you can think of a sex act, we've seen it. If you can think of things you couldn't possibly imagine as a sex act, we've seen it on perpetrators. The mistake parents make, and the mistake many of us make, is thinking this is the worst. Parents will say, oh, thank God she wasn't penetrated. And we'll say, That's maybe not so true. Because having kids see pornography can sometimes be more traumatic than being penetrated. Being fondled by your dad can be more traumatic than having a stranger have sex with you. Having your picture taken naked and knowing that every day of your life some guy is out there enjoying it, maybe hundreds of guys every night enjoying it, can be more traumatic than one time being fondled. Do not make the mistake of thinking one is better or worse than the other. Everyone's going to react to trauma different, and each of these are going to affect a kid in a different way. And you don't know what way that's going to be. So what we try to tell parents is, it may have only been fondling, but you don't know the impact that had on your child. What that meant to them. So let's talk about that. It may have only been a picture, but we're going to have to talk about what is she going to do when that shows up on her graduation day or her wedding day when somebody sends it to her. So that's the main thing, is just, it's this. It's when a perpetrator does something for their sexual gratification, and don't make the mistake of thinking one is worse or thank God it was only this. You're supposed to have like 2 or 3 things you take out of a lecture. This is one of them I want you to take out. Sexual abuse happens, and it happens often. If you do not believe that, you will not look for it. You'll overlook it, you won't see it. And perpetrators tell us they count on you believing that. This is guys interviewed in prison. They say, we count on people believing it's rare. Because I did it under their nose, and they never even looked. How often? Ralston House uses the most conservative stats. Most of you will hear a figure 1 in 4, 1 in 6. The newest research shows that actually we're reducing sexual abuse because people are reporting more, perpetrators are going to jail more. But this is the current. 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 10 boys will be sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. 15% of our total population before they hit 18 has been sexually abused. And if you're a girl, it's a lot higher than that. 30% of victims, according to anonymous studies, will go to the grave with it. They will never, ever tell anyone. They'll take it with them. This is one I want to point out. 0.5% do kids make it up. Of all the allegations made, study after study shows it's between 1.5% of kids making it up. What do you hear all the time? Kids make it up. Be careful, kids are going to make it up. There's a reason that is out there. One is that it would be horrible to be falsely accused. So that's going to be a great news story. The other part of that is there are organized groups of perpetrators who put out false statistics. NAMBLA is the one you probably all heard of, National Association of Man-Boy Love. They're an organized group that puts out, quote, scholarly articles that say kids make this up all the time. Their sort of motto is, if not by 8, too late. If you haven't had sex with a boy by 8 years old, you've ruined him developmentally. And they put out articles that preach that. So you hear about this fake outcries all the time. And think about if you're a kid. Of all the things you could accuse somebody, do you really want to accuse them of sexual abuse where you get to describe their penis, what they did, all the things they did to you and your body? That's not going to be a fun one to pick. 4% of the total accusations are made up overall, and most of those are made up by adults. My wife and I are divorcing, I want custody, I say her boyfriend's doing something. But still, we're talking 4%. What you don't hear is this one. 20% of victims, where there is physical evidence and a confession by the perpetrator, still say, nope, wasn't me. We've had kids where we've shown them photos they're in, and they will say, that's not me. Because of the way these guys commit the crimes and the way they make kids feel about this crime. It is, look, 20 times more likely, 40 times more likely that a kid will not tell you, that they will deny being sexually abused when there's evidence and a confession than they will ever make it up. 80% of kids initially deny in some way. But all we hear about is false allegations. And this holds true with teens too. Little kids are about 0.5, teens are about 1.5 to 1. But we hear this all the time. And the other thing is most victims disclose accidentally. They don't come home and say, Mom, guess what the soccer coach and I were doing this afternoon? They act out sexually on something. They say something to a friend. Somebody walks in on something. It's not something kids want to talk about, again, because of the way guys commit these crimes. What does it do? Why do we care about it? It basically deprives kids of their normal developmental task as a child. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are just some of the things. A few I'll point out. More likely to commit suicide or attempt suicide, eating disorders if you're a girl, long-term depression and relationship issues, more likely to use drugs and alcohol than the normal population, more likely to be a perpetrator, although I will point out it is not a one-to-one relationship. If you're perped on, you're more likely than the average population to be a perpetrator, but it's still a low percentage of kids who are perped on who become perpetrators. What it does basically is change the way a kid views life. I'll put out a couple of highlights. When people want to say prostitution a victimless crime, 73% of prostitutes were molested before they reached the age of 16. It's not victimless. They were victims before they ever chose the sex trade. If chose is the word. 60% of teen moms, according to surveys, sexually abused. And this is a new one. As they started asking the question in adult drug and alcohol inpatient settings, the highest level of drug and alcohol treatment, they started getting an answer. They never asked this before. They started saying, were you sexually abused as a child? 60 to 80%, whichever survey you want to look at, says at the highest level in drug and alcohol treatment, they were abused. 75% of juvenile girls in a couple of studies who get identified as delinquent, sexually abused. And then about 15% of the population, but 32% of the convicted killers sexually abused. Again, I'm not excusing killing. I'm just saying it messes with who you are developmentally. It messes with your total view of the world. The good news is it's eminently treatable. Kids who tell, are believed, and get treatment get better. Study after study shows that. Doesn't mean there's not a scar, but time and time again, studies show that kids who tell, believe, get treatment, do well long term. Those negative results go away. And I want to point out, there will be somebody who will be horribly sexually molested their entire life. They will never get treatment. They will never get any help, and they will do great. Because as you all know, in the field you're in, everyone responds to trauma differently. Some people come back from Iraq and need to go, are hospitalized for PTSD. Others walk right back into their lives. You can't predict. But we do know statistically that's not what's going to happen if you're sexually abused. Statistically, we're looking at long-term bad outcomes unless you get treatment. So this is what we'll talk about mainly today is perps. And Kenneth Landing was the leading sort of profiler for the FBI, and it's a great quote. We should fear them not because they're monsters, but because they're ordinary. You'll see that they're not much different than us, except in a couple of ways. And in their outward characteristics, Abel and Harlow are the leading researchers and treatment researchers in the country on perps. They mirror Americans in all their outward characteristics, except one or two, which we'll go into. So this is one of them. 90 to 95% are male. This figure, some researchers are thinking there may be as high as 15% of all perps are female, but we can't get good stats because what we know from victims is they say it is more horrifying and degrading and affecting to be assaulted by a female than it is a male. And you can sort of picture why in our society it is easier to pick. Men are always sort of depicted as sort of these sex-crazed things, so even a dad makes more sense than a mom. Even a grandpa more than a grandma. A brother more than a sister. So we may have a slight percentage higher on this because we know victims of female perps are less likely to talk about it. But still, it's the majority is going to be male. 30 to 40% of victims are going to be abused by a family member. 50% by someone that family trusted. Coach, teacher, babysitter, school bus driver, neighbor, best friend. Only 10% by strangers. That's national. At Ralston House, we see less than 2% of our cases are stranger assaults. Almost all ours fit into these two categories. And this is one we don't think about. 40% of kids are perped on by teens, by adolescents. And when you ask perpetrators in prison, when did you have your first assault? Almost 100% will say during adolescence was the first time I started assaulting. So we know perps are starting then. But we often don't have the same rules for teens when we have them like in sports organizations or churches. Adults can't walk a kid into the bathroom, but if you're a teenager, go ahead. It's fine. We don't have the same ability to do background checks because you can't see juvenile records. But we know that 40% of kids are perped on by that group, because that's when they start. And I should point out, I am talking about the 90% of guys who we're talking about the group that commits 92% of sex assaults on kids. That other 8% is a group made up of sociopaths, psychopaths, whatever you want to call them, and they're assaulting to cause pain, control, torture, fear. They assault for different reasons. We'll talk about why these guys assault. This is the majority, but there are those, and they tend to be those strangers. The guy who grabs a kid, tortures them, and then kills them. That's that sociopath, but that's not generally these guys. What do they look like? If you lay out the demographics of America, how many people, what percentage of people have 5 kids, what have 4, who has a 6-figure income, who has a no income, high education, low education, anything you want. Perps, you lay them down, they fit perfect. They match it like a glove, except 2 areas. They're predominantly male, and they attend church more than the rest of us. And that's not because church is bad. We'll talk about why they would want to attend church more than all of us. This is what makes them different. Child sex perpetrators, this 92%, they are sexually aroused by children. This is not adult rape. This is not about control, power. This is about being sexually aroused. My preferred sexual partner is a child. Doesn't mean I also don't have sex with adult males, females. But my preferred is this. And this is the key. You can't see that. None of you can tell me who my preferred sexual partner is. Male, female, dog, cat, child. You don't know. You can't see that. I don't wear a sign that says this is what it is. There's not a certain kind of clothing that says that. And we think we can tell. But you cannot see who I'm sexually aroused by. And perps know that. But we don't always remember that. So we think they seem like a nice guy. They go along with this. They date a woman. They're married to a guy. Doesn't matter. We can't see who they're sexually aroused by. And that's what makes them different from the general population, is that one characteristic. We have families who ask this question all the time. Why would a coach who wanted to help kids, why would a man of God do this to my child? And perps laugh at us. I've seen the tapes of these guys interviewed in jail. They laugh. They say, I became a coach. I became a teacher. I became a minister to get access to kids. I became a social worker. I get to meet one-on-one in a room with kids and they tell me their deepest, darkest secrets. You don't think I can bond with them? I became that to get access. It's like John Dillinger said. Why do you rob banks? That's where they keep the money. Why do I choose a profession where parents trust me, kids trust me, and I have access? That's where they keep what I want. And perpetrators realize this. I drive the school bus instead of RTD. I get access to kids. I work at the school cafeteria instead of first cafeteria. I get access to kids. So we're always surprised when we hear that, like, can't believe anyone, at my facility did this. Well, why not? If you were a perp, where would you want to go and look for kids? How do they appear on the outside? Here's what we hear from people. Nice, charming, likable, law-abiding. They don't have long legal records unless they've been caught for perpetration. Otherwise, a misdemeanor here, a driving violation, something like that. But they look like us. And Galvin de Becker is somebody we'll talk about a little later, but I love this quote. Niceness is a decision. It is not a character trait. The grumpy old guy down the street who yells at you every time you park in front of his house or step on his lawn might be the person you could trust your kids, your money, anything with, because he has good character. He's just grumpy. We can all act nice. We have a fight with our significant other before we come into work. Someone's house, how you doing? Most of the time you say, fine, I'm doing good, and you act nice. You put it on. It's easy to do. Perpetrators know that. They count on you believing if I act nice to you, if I bring donuts in, if I wear a tie, if I talk nicely to you, that you'll think, that Don, he seemed like a nice guy. That's what I want you to think. And I can act nice. But you have no idea what I'm planning to do to my family when I leave this room tonight. You have no idea what I did to my kids this morning before I left for work. You can't tell by what I'm doing now what I did 2 hours ago. And they count on you believing that you can tell, that niceness means we're nice all the time. This came from a survey of about 3,000 perpetrators. They said these are some of the things we count on people believing. It helps us do our job. And they think of it as a job in many cases. Public behavior predicts private. You just have to read the sports page or the political news to find some politics. John Andrews is the newest one, I guess, on the front. You know, that his public persona was not what his private was. But we always believe it. We have the person who comes in and acts this way and we say they must be nice, but we don't know them outside of work. Or we don't know them outside of their role that we're seeing them in. People are good. I have 5 kids. I tell my kids, people are good. But not all people are good, and not all people have your good intentions in heart. So don't make it blanket. You can believe people are good, and you can still look to trust, figure out whether you should trust them and how to verify whether they're somebody you can be alone with or trust. You should be polite to others. Perps tell us they use this to get you to bend your boundaries or to do something you don't want to do. Because we're taught from an early age to say please and thank you and not be disruptive. So an example I give is you go to a car lot and you tell the salesman you walk on the lot, look, I'm not buying today, no matter what you do. I just want to look around by myself. And they say, okay, Don, go ahead and walk around. And you're walking around, you stop. When I start looking at that car and really get serious, I hear over my shoulder, Don, I can get you a deal on that one today. You know, we just have that one going out. My manager's anxious. And most of us don't turn around and say, get the hell away from me. We say, okay, and it's fine for a car salesman. Perps do the same thing. What do you mean there's this rule that we're not supposed to have one-on-one time? Do you think I'm going to do something to a kid? Put you in a position to be impolite, to say, I don't know, maybe. You know, what do you mean you don't let your kids go camping with strangers? I'm not a stranger. I coach your kid. Why wouldn't you let me? You're not one of those overprotective parents, are you? You're not thinking I did anything wrong. They use it to get us to back off because we're taught to not be confrontational. We're taught to be polite. People change. And again, I do believe people change. But what perpetrators will tell you is their desire to have sex with kids does not leave. That urge is there. And if they've truly changed, they'll tell you, I cannot be around children. It's the difference between the guy who gets out of prison and goes to the church and says, I want to attend your church. I'm a child perpetrator. I just got out of prison. What service do you want me to attend? Which 2 guys do you want me to check in and watch me when I'm at church? Because that's part of my treatment plan. As opposed to the guy says, just got out of prison for perpetrating on kids, found Jesus in prison, feeling much better now, and I want to make it up to the little devils. I want to go ahead and teach your Sunday school classes. That is not change. So while there are perpetrators I know of who seriously do never want to hurt another child and are doing everything they can to make sure they don't do that, there are many who say they change and don't, and that urge does not leave them. Religious persons are honest and good. Christians are good people. I'm not saying that's not true. But that's what perpetrators count on. They count on you believing that. Because if you see me sitting at church next to you every Sunday, you think I'm there for the same reasons you are. To build a relationship with God, to be part of a community, to make a better person of myself. And I'm there to be seen. I'm there because I want you to see me at church so that you trust me. And that's why they attend church more than the rest of us. Because what they will say is Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims are gullible. If they see you at their service, they believe you're a good guy. They are that gullible. They want to believe in the goodness of people. Imagine that. And they use that against us. There was a guy here, I think he was on the Denver Post now maybe 5 years ago, front page, John Candaria. He assaulted a number of kids over the years. When he first started assaulting in New Mexico 20 years ago, he was practicing Catholic and went to Mass every day. When they caught him here in Denver, he was a Latter-day Saint. And I'm sure he was a Methodist and a Buddhist and 4 other religions in between. Because he said once he didn't have anything else to lose, once he was signed for life, he's like, it got people to trust me. It got me into their lives, and that's what I wanted, to get in their lives. Finally, they count on us believing we can tell when people lie, and we cannot with perpetrators. Anna Salter, one of the leading experts on perps, took a bunch of perps to Quantico, Virginia, where the FBI has its polygraphers, the world's best polygraphers, and some of those guys passed the polygraphs. If the FBI polygraphers who are trained, all they do are trained to detect lie, can't detect these guys lying, you're not going to be able to. And when you watch the videos of these perps, it's like they've shared information, because they will say, I practice lying. I do it in front of a mirror. I watch how you tell the truth, what gestures you use, how much details, and I imitate it. I stare into my own eyes in the mirror so I can look you in the eye and say, I've never hurt your kid. How could you believe that of me? You cannot tell if these guys are lying. It's what they work on. And they will tell you they work. They spend time on it. And we just don't think that way. So, it's not, and perpetration is not something that just happens. Occasionally they'll do something stupid. They'll get an urge and they'll act on it and get caught. But most of the time they are identifying a number of potential victims. They're not saying, I want her. They're saying, this side of the room looks good. And I'm going to see who rises to the top. Who gives me opportunity? Who has some things I might be looking for? But I'm not going to pick one, because if that one doesn't work, I'm dried up. If she's not somebody who I can get under my power, if I can't separate her, get her one-on-one, then I have nobody. I need somebody. I need to have 4 or 5 going on at the same time. They identify potential parents. And many of them will say they start with the parents before they ever start with the kids. And they identify entire communities to groom. We'll talk about that. But here's a key. When they interviewed these guys in prison, their average amount of time when they were out of prison they spent thinking about hurting kids, 10 hours a day. They spend more time in it than we ever do. I've got 5 kids. I'm an okay parent, and I spend maybe 10, 15 minutes a day thinking about their safety. Don't go out and drink. Be careful. Remember who you are. Drive slow. There's my safety warnings for the day. And I'm off about my business. They spend 10 hours thinking how to hurt my kids. They win. They spend more time in that than we do. So they talk about selecting victims, and they look for certain type of victims. And I'll emphasize over and over, I say it too much, not one of these traits makes anybody a bad person. These are just things they see as vulnerabilities. So parents who are having problems, dad lost his job. He now has to go take a lower paying job. Mom has to go to work, and mom hasn't had to work before. Maybe she's working irregular hours. How's that? That's a problem for the family, but it also means they're probably going to need a babysitter. I might be willing to step in there. Family has a kid with cancer. We just had a case like this. One of their kids has cancer. You think that family might have to spend more time going to chemo and at the hospital with that child? You think the other kids may not get as much attention as the one who's in and out of the hospital? Oh, that's great. The other kids may need more attention. I can fill that role for them. You need babysitters? You guys need a night out after being in the hospital? I'll take care of that. You're tired? Maybe aren't noticing things as clearly? Don't worry. I'll watch them for you. That family didn't do anything wrong by having a child with cancer. I just see it as a vulnerability. Parents who are struggling with parenting. At some point, every parent struggles with parenting, whether it's their teenage years or early on, where they get burnt out or tired or their kid's mad at them. Perps see that as a way of getting in. Your junior high kid and you are not getting along well? Great. I'll try to isolate them from you. I'll try to tell them how to get along with you in a way of just lying to you, and then I'll be their sounding board. And then when I start hurting them, I'll have broken their relationship with you so much that they won't have any way of coming back to you and talking to you about it. Single or divorced families, there's nothing wrong with that. But it sounds trite, but we still see it at Ralston House. Oh, you don't have a husband involved? Let me be your son's male role model. I'll take him camping on the weekends. I'll do this, I'll do that. And I work my way in so I get access. Those parents didn't do anything wrong. They trusted somebody. At some point, my kids have all sorts of trusting adults in their lives, from coaches to teachers to Sunday school to friends to neighbors. You have to let adults in. But these guys know it, and they take advantage of it. For children, I'm not going to go through all these, just a couple. All kids, though, if you look through there, go through most of this. But we have perps who say, I assault kids under 2. Kids under 2 can't talk. At Ralston House, we did, we do about 1,000 interviews a year. When we have to interview a 2-year-old, we're lucky if we get anything. And we don't interview under 2 because they're not verbal. And perps know that. So if I assault a 2-year-old, how are they going to tell what I'm doing? We had one guy recently who said, autistic kids, I love them. They act so weird. When I assault them and they act weirder, they just think it's the autism. They don't have the words or verbal skills to be able to tell. So how is anyone going to know what I'm doing to them? Kids who are eager to please. I bring this one up because we forget kids are human. They're not little angels. And you will have kids who will trade sex for other things. And not in the sense of, prostitution, trading for money. But we had a kid who said, 8 hours a week, this guy mentored me, gave me the attention I didn't get anywhere else, took me places, taught me things. 1 hour a week wasn't so great. I took the 1 to get the 8. That kid's not a bad kid. That's an adult preying on a kid. But we don't like to think about that there are some kids who will do things to please adults that we think are horrible, but it's the adult who's manipulated them into that. And then the other one is kids who were previously abused. That one, a lot of times people say, now why is that? Because, one, perpetrators study the psychology of kids a lot. They will tell you they read a lot, try to learn. Kids who have been abused before, if they get abused again, many times they think, this is what life is. It happened before, it's happened again, it must be my lot. Why would I report? 2, if I abuse a kid who's been abused before and she says something, I might say, what, she's the only kid who gets abused? I heard she accused somebody else before. Now she's accusing me. What, only one who gets abused? Yeah, it sounds like a little bit too much crying wolf. People start to think, yeah, that is funny that kid, none of the other kids in the classroom are claiming it, only the one who'd already been abused, and I hear that does strange things to them. Perpetrators know that. They know people's reactions, so of course that makes them more vulnerable. Because I can play on you believing that maybe this kid's making it up. And again, I just want to straight, it can happen to anyone. Most of the families we see in Ralston House are great families. They love their children, they want to do the right things, they want to keep them safe, but they had to trust somebody in their life, and that person broke their trust. And this would be my second big point. Besides sex abuse happens, it's one person's fault. It's the perpetrator's fault. 4 of my kids are girls. My 4 oldest are girls. My youngest is a boy. My 4 girls, I told them, you're running through Central Park, New York, naked at 2 in the morning, and someone rapes you. Be clear. It's one person's fault. It's the rapist's fault. We'll talk about you could be smarter. You could run in the daylight. You could run with a big group of people, and you could wear clothes. We'll talk about all those safety issues over and over again. But make no mistake, nobody had to jump out of the bushes at you. And this is the key. Kids who are sexually abused do not believe it's only the perpetrator's fault. They believe it's their fault. Parents who have kids who are sexually abused do not believe it's only the perpetrator's fault. They believe it's their fault. And it keeps the silence. If we could convince everybody of this, then people would talk. If you leave work today and you drive out on Chambers and someone rear ends you, when you come in tomorrow, you'll say, you're not going to believe it, some idiot ran a stoplight and rear-ended me. When you're sexually abused, you don't tell because you know it was your fault. If you're rear-ended, you think, somebody else's fault. That doesn't affect who I am as a person. But perpetrators make sure kids know it's their fault. And if we could get them, this is why people don't tell. This is why parents sometimes protect their kids don't tell law enforcement. Because they think if I tell, they'll realize I did something wrong. They'll take my kids from me. I don't want to face that I did something wrong. And they didn't. They can make whatever mistakes they made. Some adult had to have sex with that kid. And that's the one who did something wrong. How do perpetrators operate? The only thing I really want to say about this is that they don't go through this in a geometric procession. They're in all different stages. They're abusing one kid. They're having thoughts about 3 others. They're already grooming some new kids, and they're taking another kid and starting to break down their resistance. Because if I like 7 and 8-year-olds and this kid's 8.5, 9, they're moving out of my territory. I got to feed that production line. So I'm working on some new ones, and I'm starting to touch this one, and I'm talking to their parents over here about getting to go camping with them. I can't have my supply end. So we often make the mistake of saying 1, 2, 3, 4. It's all over. They're in all the stages all the time. So I want to talk about grooming, and grooming is getting somebody to trust you, basically. Getting somebody, breaking into their lives. And I use what I call my cheap example, and most people know this already, but I still use it, is the big cross on the hill that we look out and see above Denver, put up by one of the biggest perpetrators in Denver. It's over his father's grave. And it was Mr. Vandiver, who's Marilyn Vandiver's father, who was a Miss America, I think, in 1958. He was on the board of the zoo and I think the museum board, big charitable donor, 4 beautiful girls, wealthy. At 40 years old, after her father had died, and she was a Miss America, had been on a couple of TV programs, was a world-renowned speaker around the world, married, wealthy, high society. At 40 years old, she said, guess what? My dad had sex with me from the time I was 5 till I went away to see you at college. And what did the community of Denver and state say? You're a nut. You're a crazy woman. Your dad would never do that. He was on the board of the museum. He built a cross on the hill. People who build crosses on the hill and are wealthy do not do this. You are a complete nut. Wealthy woman, intelligent, straight A's at CU. All these, but she was a nut until her sister, her older sister, said, not so crazy. From the time I was 5, and even when I ran away to Kansas to college to get away from him, he came out and rented hotel rooms and made me come back to the hotel room with him. And then other girls in the community who weren't related said, not so crazy. He assaulted me too. But he had groomed an entire community so that even when he was dead, they could not believe he could do this. And how often do you see, when there's an accusation, the first reaction of the crowd is, couldn't do it. Not, boy, we'll have to think about this. I hope he didn't do it. I'm going to support the kid but hope that he didn't do anything wrong. It's always, no way he could do it. Because they groom communities. So what does that look like if it's not Denver? If I'm working here, I'm bringing in snacks every day for people. I'm covering everybody's extra shifts. I'm staying long and I'm coming in early. I'm doing anything I can to get you to like me. Now that also may be the best employee. That's the problem. Employee of the year and perp of the year look exactly alike. It's their motivations. It's the part you can't see. But that's what they tell us they do. They're often the most invaluable person in the agency. The person everyone can trust that is always going out of their way. So you can't tell just by their behaviors. But I'm going to do that because I don't want to be the old crank at the agency who, the minute an allegation is against me, everyone's going to go, yay, we can finally get rid of him. I want to be somebody they think, I just cannot believe it could be him. Of all the people, and we hear it all the time, of all the people. So understand that they look at grooming whole communities. They're setting their image up long before they start to hurt a kid in many cases. Families, many perps will talk about, they look at grooming the families before they do the kids. They try to make sure that they're a friend of the family, that there's a reason for that family to trust them. They're nice to the parents. We had a 15-year-old who said when parents moved into his neighborhood and he knew they had kids, he didn't even pay attention to their kids. But he couldn't wait for it to snow. And he got up extra early and shoveled their walks for them for free. Their trash blew down the street, he picked it up for them. And he got a reputation as a good kid because he said, every parent needs a babysitter sooner or later. And I was the good kid on the block. Didn't even pay, he said, I never even acted like I liked the kids. I just paid attention to the stuff, and they would sooner or later ask me to babysit. And often as parents, we become, as any adult, we become their best supporters. We tell our kids things like, there's no way so-and-so would do this. Kid comes home and says, I don't like my math teacher. And we say, oh, Mr. Johnson's been at the high school forever. I love Mr. Johnson. Maybe that kid was trying to broach a subject. You've just cut him off And it could be, you could say, the difference is saying, what don't you like about Mr. Johnson? Oh, he gives us homework every night. All right, stop your whining and do your homework. That's a good math teacher. Or, every time we have quiet time, he comes up and rubs my shoulders. And I've asked him not to, and he just keeps doing it. Two different answers. But oftentimes, in our enthusiasm of liking somebody, he's the greatest coach. His teams have won the championship 3 years in a row. You're lucky to make his team. I better not say anything about him. Mom and Dad really like that guy. When I said I didn't like him, they didn't seem to react well. And we do it by accident. And they're charming. They make us feel, you know, I don't like Uncle Henry. Oh, Uncle Henry's just Uncle Henry. Don't pay. He's always been handsy. He doesn't mean anything by it. Instead of listening. So often by accident, we tell our kids not to tell us things. And we can do it with staff. At places residential, I worked residential, and kids are always complaining about staff. But you have to listen. And then you can figure it out. He's so tough, he doesn't let us do any of the fun things. Oh, all right, tough. That's different than, you know, he creeps me out. And gives you examples about it. So we have to listen. We have to tell them, anybody can tell on anybody here. There's nobody here we won't listen to a complaint about. Doesn't mean we're going to believe you. But we're going to listen to it, and then we're going to figure it out. Where they spend most of their time, though, is grooming the child. And they'll talk about really engaging them in childlike behavior. So this John Canderi, I like using him. I'll use him as an example a lot because he was very prototypical of Perps. He, when police got a warrant to go into his home, 4 video game systems, 200 video games, hundreds of Matchbox cards, Yu-Gi-Oh cards, Magic cards, any child's game you can imagine John had. Kids liked spending time with John. It was fun. And they'll say, I know more about your kids than you do. I know what the latest trends are. I know what the fun things are. Because I need kids to like me. I want them to be around me. So they are very good at engaging kids in peer-like involvement. Not an adult to a child, but like we're peers. They break down a child's resistance to touch. So hugging, kissing, those kind of things. Why do adults have sex? Because it feels really good. It can feel very good to a 4-year-old. And we forget that. Parents say, tell me if somebody hurt you. It didn't hurt, felt great. Felt like love. Because if I think about little kids, they like being held in your lap. They like being touched. And if I'm gentle enough and I take my time and I groom them enough, I can have full sex with them and they may never realize it's anything but a hug and a kiss. No difference to them. And we forget that. So they will try to break down that touching by tickling, hugging, grabbing, slowly getting them used to those kind of touches and then moving on. They're also going to test how a kid reacts to those kind of touches. Did they back away right away? That may not be one I want to go for. Did they seem to like touching? Each of my kids was different. I had some of my kids were really huggers. Some of them were like, I don't want to be hugged. Nothing wrong with it. It's just they'll try to break down that resistance to any kind of touch so that kids will eventually get used to it and may never tell because they may not know what's going on. They find ways to isolate a child. One, you have to get a kid alone to perp on them. You don't want to do it in front of a crowd. Somebody's likely to tell. But more than getting them alone physically, they're going to try to get that kid isolated emotionally. If I can keep that kid only talking to me, if I can convince that kid that their parents are not supportive, that I'm the supportive one, if I can convince that kid other staff don't have their best interests, but I do, I'm the one to come to with your problems. The more I can build that relationship, the more I can keep them focused on me and isolate them, the better. There was a basketball coach here in Colorado who was probably the best girls basketball coach we've had, and he ended up hanging himself in the Douglas County Jail after he was caught. But one of the things he did, no cell phones at practice, no parents watching practice. Practice during proms, during dances, anything important. So those kids had nowhere else to go. He told them, if you're on this team and you want to get into Division I basketball, and he's putting anywhere from 6 to 7 girls a year in Division I basketball, if you want on this team, this becomes your life. What it did was isolate them. And when things started to happen, they didn't have people to go to. and certainly not people who were going to be willing to listen that the greatest coach in Colorado was doing something wrong. And so that's one of their ways they'll try. They'll threaten violence, but we hardly see violence at Ralston House, other than the actual sexual act. Because if I'm a soccer coach and I want to assault your daughter, if she comes home beaten and bloody, what are you going to say? You're going to say, something's going on at soccer. I'm going to find out. So I may threaten violence. I may say, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to hurt you. But seldom do we see it in child sex abuse, because they don't want to leave marks. They've got to have that kid coming back. It's a supply. You can't just keep replacing that supply. And the kind of violence they threaten, I'll kill you. I'll kill your mom, I'll kill your dad, I'll kill your dog, I'll kill your cat. I'll kill myself. How did grandma going to feel when she finds out because you were going to tell I killed myself? You think grandma's going to like that her son's dead because of you? What did your dad tell you if anyone ever hurt you? He said he'd kill him. Let me explain what happens to murderers. You've seen TV. Murderers go to jail for the rest of their life. So let me fill out the whole scenario for you, 8-year-old boy. If you tell, your dad's going to kill me. I'm going to be dead. And you know, I do this you don't like, but you like me otherwise. Your dad's going to jail. Social services is going to ask questions like, why did your mom let you hang out with me and marry a murderer? So they're going to take you away and you're going to go into foster care. Now make the decision to tell, 8-year-old. They don't have to do violence because they can threaten. They can put them in a position that it is impossible for them to tell. One guy said, if you tell, before the police can get to you, I'll get to you because I'll know. And you know how I'll know? I'm sending guys by your house every night watching. Tonight they're going to be driving by in blue cars. Go home and watch. Any blue cars drive by your house? This kid saw a blue car go by his house. He knew this guy had somebody watching him. How can he tell? So they threaten, but we seldom actually see the violence beyond the actual act. Bargaining, you have to do this because I've been giving you good grades. I've been giving you special privileges. Now this is the way you earn those. You get it back. You have to do this because you know if you let me in here to read a story to you at night, I'm going to get horny. And you told me I could come in and read, so because you did that, now you get this. Again, and where's the blame on that? It's on the kid. They make the child feel responsible. They blame the child and they encourage keeping the secret, and this is the key component. It's what we call a double bind. They put kids in double bind so that if they tell, it reveals the kid's weakness. I picked you because you wanted it. Boys get an erection whether they enjoy it or not. It's a biological reaction. And if that boy gets an erection, I say, you got an erection, you must have liked it, otherwise you wouldn't have gotten an erection. Whose fault is it? He liked it. It must be his fault. If you didn't like it, why did you come to practice? You knew I was going to do this. I bring my nephew over, we're sitting on the couch watching Bronco games. I say, your parents aren't here. You know, during a Bronco game, nothing tastes better than a beer. Have a beer with me. He has a beer. Next time he comes over, he has 2 beers. Then I start touching him. He threatens to tell. I say, you were over here drinking. Go ahead and tell. I'll tell your parents you were drinking. And it sounds stupid as an adult, but kids buy it. With teen girls, drugs and alcohol are one of the keys we see all the time. You use meth, you use pot, you drank with me. If you hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened. If you tell, the police will be more interested in arresting you for drug use than they are what I did, because they'll know it was consensual. And it's the kid's fault. Girl scores a goal in soccer. She comes out, I give her a side hug. Good job. Next time she scores a goal, she jumps in my arms, I give her a big front hug. Next time she scores, by accident when I'm going to give her a front hug, my hand brushes her rear end. Next time she's coming in after scoring a goal, and my hand just barely hits her breast as I'm going around her. 2 weeks later, we're working one-on-one because I've convinced her parents, this is a Division I scholarship girl. I can get her there if we can have some one-on-one time. And I start to touch her, and she says, what are you doing? And I say, what am I doing? Same thing we've been doing for weeks. Are you some kind of tease? When I grabbed your breast, you didn't back away. You seemed to come right in for the hug. When I grabbed your butt, you seemed to sure like it. You didn't stop me then. Go ahead and tell. I'll tell what you've been doing already. And suddenly that girl thinks, I thought it was just, but maybe, what do I say to my mom? My dad's going to ask. She can't tell. And the longer you don't tell, the more they have you trapped. Because what is the first question people ask when a kid tells? And it's 6 months later. Why? We don't mean anything by it. Parents don't mean anything by it. I'm not blaming parents. But it's our typical, why didn't you tell? That's an accusation. And kids know that. They hear those questions. They watch the news with their parents and their parents say, why wouldn't that kid have told? You know, it's hard to tell, and I didn't tell either, so I wonder if they think I should have told too. And then they don't tell. And perps know the longer they get you to keep the secret, the harder it is to ever let it out. And they count on putting kids in this position. We had a teen, and we forget also what it's like to be a kid. Because we forget what trouble means. Trouble is big stuff to a kid. We had a teenage babysitter who babysat kids, and the way he held their silence sounds ridiculous. And I wouldn't believe it except we saw it. These are what the kids said. He would babysit them. He'd say, what's your favorite TV show? What TV show do your parents not let you watch? And it was Law and Order, SVU, one of those things. And he let them watch it. And after he babysat a couple times and had their trust and the parents' trust, he started molesting them. When the kids threatened to tell, he said, if you tell, I'll tell your parents you watched that show. And this wouldn't have happened if you watched that show, if you hadn't watched that show. He did two things. He said, one, if you tell, you're going to get in trouble. And I know, you, as an adult, you think, what parent would care what show their kids watch when it comes to finding out their child was molested? But kids don't think that way. And two, he added a key ingredient, and this shows how young perps sort of learn their trade. He said, and because you watched the show, this happened. And the kids thought, my parents must have known that this would happen if I watched the show, and I watched the show. And whose fault is it then? It wasn't the guy's fault. It was because they watched the show. It's the messages you hear over and over from adults who have been molested to kids who have been molested is that they owned it. There's a hockey player in Canada, Sheldon Kennedy. In Canada, if you're a great hockey player, at a young age they send you away to like a semi-pro team. At 12, he was one of the youngest to go to one of these semi-pro teams. Went there the first night he was there. His coach got naked, put a shotgun over his lap, and raped Sheldon. And continued raping Sheldon until he left for the Detroit Red Wing camp when he was 18 years old. Big hockey player. Big, strong hockey player. Played for the Red Wings and the Bruins. Eventually did tell. But Sheldon and I have been at a couple of events together and talked about this. When he finally decided to tell at 27 that he was molested, and if you go to Canada and mention Sheldon, everyone knows him because he has set up one of the most amazing prevention programs in the world in Canada around hockey and sports. But he said, when I was 27, I called the Mounties and said, I will only talk to you if we meet in a restaurant and you don't wear your uniform. And I said, why was that, Sheldon? And he said, because I knew it was me. There was something in me that made him pick me out of everyone else. Joe Sakic was on his team. So he didn't rape Joe Sakic, he raped me. So what was it about me that caused that? I was too embarrassed. Big old strong hockey. Why wouldn't I resist it? I was 17. By the time I was 17, 18, I was bigger than him. Why didn't I stop? He said, you got to remember, Don, my first sexual experience was with a fat guy with a shotgun across his lap at 12. I don't think I had had a wet dream. I don't think I'd ever even thought of sex. All I thought about was hockey. And that was my first sexual experience. I didn't know if sex was good, bad, and different. That was my experience for the next 6 years. What it turned out, of course, is that this guy had molested hundreds of kids. Theo Fleury, who played for the Avalanche too, was also molested by this guy. And hundreds of other kids. But Sheldon said today, who's in his 40s, when I was up in Canada 2 years ago with him, he said, there are still days I wake up and I know it was me. I can logically get it, but there are still days it sure feels like I did something wrong. And that's what the perps are great at, because they can't have kids tell. Because I have to have them keep this secret, because if I'm a second grade teacher, I can't have them tell that night when they go home. I can't have them tell the next day, the next semester, in third grade, fourth grade. I want to retire from Jeffco and get para. I've got to make sure they're one of that 30% who never, ever tell. Because once you do this, you can't ever have somebody tell. So you've got to figure out ways to keep it trapped inside the kid. And the best way is to make sure they understand it was their fault. The things you least like to talk about are the things you know you did wrong. Not the things you're proud of, not the things somebody else did wrong. We're fine talking about what everybody else did wrong, but we don't like to talk about what we did wrong, and that's what perps are great at, making kids believe. They find out ways to keep kids' secrecy. Maybe it's something simple. Here's a toy, don't tell your parents about it. Here's $5, we don't need to let them know. And all they're trying to do is to see what a kid will tell or not. Some kids are better at keeping secrets. That's a kid I want to molest. Doesn't mean it's a bad kid. I just want to see how reliable they are. You know, it can be as simple as I make a joke. Kid comes back to practice. Last year I coached her. This year I'm coaching her again. She comes back and I say, boy, that uniform sure filled out over the summer, didn't it? Now, if she doesn't say anything, all right, we've got a little, I've taken a little step. She's held a secret. She knows I probably shouldn't have said that. We've taken a little step together, and I'm going to use that. They invoke guilt. Look what you've done. We had a father recently who, when the 6-year-old was telling us, said, well, he always said if I wore my nightgown out, it made him do this to me. It made him want me to touch me. So whose fault is it? Hers. She should have known not to wear a nightgown at 6 in front of her dad. The compliant victim, and we don't mean anything bad by this. By this we mean this is a victim who does not see themselves as a victim. They're compliant in the sense that they believe they're not a victim. This is the 13-year-old girl or boy who believes they're in love. We had a softball coach, 15 girls on his team, he was having sex with 8 of them. None of the 8 wanted to talk about it because in 5 years, when they were legal, they were going to get married. When one girl finally talked, then the rest started breaking down. When they compared notes and found out, oh, maybe he couldn't marry all 8 of us at 18. But they weren't going to tell. They were in love. It felt good. You know, and it can feel good and the intention can feel good. I went from being popular in 6th grade to everybody else maturing, and now I got pimples and I haven't developed and everybody else is, and I'm sitting at the lunch table, and then some adult on the internet tells me I'm beautiful. Says I'm mature. Says the reason kids don't hang out with me is I'm just more mature than they are, and he understands or she understands. Why would I tell on them? It's feeling so good to me. And these are very hard cases because they will deny what's going on. And we also forget how naive kids are. We often have police officers say to us, part of our job is to educate them about teen development, and they'll say, I don't know whether to believe this girl or not. She left with this, and I asked her who her friends were, and she didn't even know their last names. And we're like, we see that all the time. Teens calling somebody a friend who they don't know their last name. Teens sneaking out of the house because they met some 17-year-old on Facebook, and he seemed really nice and went to their sister's high school, and he turned out not to be so nice. And they say, well, what did she think was going to happen when she snuck out at 10:30 at night? She thought they were going for coffee. And she really did believe that because teens are stupid. They're naive. The part of their brain that makes those long-term decisions hasn't grown together, especially for boys. My son the other day and I were arguing about something. He's 17 and we were arguing. I finally was, done with the argument. I said, when your frontal lobe connects, you can make that decision. And he's like, and he just had it in biology, I didn't realize. And he's like, dude, that won't be till I'm like 22. I almost let him go just because he was able to answer. But the point is that the part of their brain that's supposed to decide these things doesn't. And we often as adults forget teens are not little adults. And they seem that way. Police tell us all the time, why do we have to bring these teens to Ralston House? Couldn't I just do the interview? No. Because we know how to do these interviews, and actually teens are more fearful of police than young kids are. Because they have good reason, because they are probably doing something a little under the law, where a police officer they think is going to do something. But we forget how naive they are, and so they believe. The 13-year-old believes this guy likes him just for this. The 14-year-old girl believes the guy is just interested in horses, and that's all he wants to meet her about. And we just forget how it's to be that age and want to believe that people like us and want that attention. at a time when maybe your friends are ditching out on you. Anna Salter came up with this about why children don't tell. It's the biggest thing we get a question of. Why wouldn't kids just tell? Someone was hurting them, why wouldn't they tell? She says these have to go, all three of these have to happen before a child can tell. They have to realize it's a noxious and an improper event. If I'm a 5-year-old and it feels good and I think it's just one more game, I'm not going to tell. And we had a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old sister who were molested by the same babysitter. The 5-year-old came in and described the molestation in graphic detail, without a blink. And in fact, when we talked to her about the game she didn't like, it was that operation game she didn't like because she couldn't do it without buzzing the nose. This game wasn't so bad. Her 12-year-old sister couldn't look at the interviewer when she was describing the exact same molestation because one didn't realize it was a noxious event, so there was no reason to tell. The other did. So they have to understand, and if I'm in love, if I think the guy's in love with me, if I think the teacher's in love with me, the coach, that's not a noxious or improper event. That's a good thing, so I'm not going to talk about it. They have to feel safe to tell. They have to believe there aren't guys going by my house with blue cars, that my dad won't kill somebody. One of the biggest threats that perpetrators tell kids, which is just so sad, is they say, your parents will not be able to handle this if you tell. It'll kill your mom. Not physically. They're talking about mentally. And kids will tell us, I didn't tell, my mom couldn't have heard this. I just couldn't let her hear this. I couldn't let my dad know this had happened to me. I couldn't let him know those pictures are out there somewhere on the internet. They're protecting their parents, and perpetrators use those good feelings of wanting to love and protect somebody against the kid to get them not to tell. And often I say to parents, if you can give your kids one message, say, no matter what happens, I'm strong enough to hear. There's nothing in the world that can happen to you that I can't hear and that I won't get through with you. What would kill me is not knowing. That would be the thing that would hurt the most. So at any point when you want to tell, I'm ready to hear it and I will be strong enough to hear it with you. So they have to feel safe that way. They have to believe that nobody's going to kill them, that nobody's going to kill their dog, their cat, that people are going to believe that they're not going to be made fun of. Perps more and more are taking pictures of kids because cell phones have cameras and all that. If you tell, when I know the police are on their way, I'm going to push send. That picture, you know, when the first time when we did it and I had that cell phone, I took pictures of us. It'll go to everyone on your Facebook and to your dad and mom's cell phone. I want to see your dad's face when he sees that picture. I'm not safe to tell. We had 2 girls whose stepfather was molesting them. They locked themselves in their room when their mom went to the store because they knew he was coming after them. And he got to the door and couldn't get in. They said, today it ends. Today we tell Mom. No more of this. He said, fine. He walked away. He came back. He said, there's someone here to talk to you. And he had their 5-year-old sister outside the room talk to him. And he said, I'll count to 10 and then I start on her and you can listen. They didn't tell, not their own safety, their sister's safety. So this is a big one. Both of these have to happen, and then they have to believe it'll stop. If I'm Marilyn Vanderver and I'm 40 years old and I tell about my dead father, I believe the abuse will stop, but nobody believes still. Imagine if I'm a kid. Do I think anyone's going to believe me? Imagine when I've seen in the paper rioting at Penn State because some coach was accused and people were mad that there was even an accusation going around. Am I going to feel that my telling will stop it when that's the way people react? We had a kid who said, I told my mom this happened in the interview and she didn't do anything. Well, that makes us interested, so the interviewer followed up with more questions. Turns out all the kid had said to his mom was, I don't like camp. He didn't have the verbal skills to be able to say much more. To him, I don't like camp was, I don't like camp because the counselor comes in and does X, Y, and Z at night. All his mom heard was the typical complaining kid, I don't like school, I don't like camp. She didn't do a thing wrong. But when he tried telling, he stuck his toe in the water and it was cold. She didn't do anything. I'm done. I tried telling, it didn't stop. I mentioned to you that that teacher was creepy and you said, no big deal. I tried telling, cold water, pulled my foot out, I'm done trying to tell. I told somebody. How many kids have said, I told somebody, and they said, just ignore him, stay away from him. He couldn't do that. Many kids will talk about at least telling one other person before it finally comes out. And when they did, nobody did anything. And if I don't believe you're going to do anything, why am I going to go through the pain of telling you about the worst experience in my life? BS on that. And we often discourage because we make excuses for people. I know he's creepy, but he would never do that. I know he's tough on you, but he wouldn't do that. Instead of saying, let me listen, and let's start checking some things out. Let's try to figure out what's going on. The internet, I don't want to say much about it, except it makes things worse. And that most perps are not going in as being 13 and 14-year-old boys and girls anymore. They go in and say, I'm a 40-year-old guy. I saw you like Appaloosas. I have an Appaloosa ranch. I just talk to people about Appaloosas. That's all he does for months. Just talking about Appaloosas. And he watches the Facebook page and talks to her or him. And he sees those symbols go up of how they feel, happy, sad, medium. And he waits till they say, I'm mad at my parents, I'm mad at my friends. Friends are real jerks. And I say, you know, I've been waiting for that to happen. Because, you know, you're just so much more mature than most of the other people I talk to. And a lot of times mature kids like you just don't fit in. If you ever need someone just to talk to. I was mature when I was a kid. My parents really tried, you know, parents don't want you to grow up. They want to keep you down, and I get that. So just tell your parents what they want to hear. Come sit with me. We'll talk sometime. And she thinks, or he thinks, the guy's safe because he said he's a 40-year-old. He's just in there. He's not talking about sex. He's not pretending to be a 13-year-old. So he must be safe. And that's how they use it. We also believe it's probably causing more perps to act on their impulses than would have in the past. If I felt an attraction to children in the past, there were a lot of lines I had to cross before I could act on it. So I may never act. I may just keep that inside my whole life and never act on it. Because maybe I wanted child porn. Well, 25 years ago, I had to go to Kitty's Arcade downtown. Someone might see me walk in there. That would be embarrassing for the director of Ralston House to walk into a porn shop. I had to go into the porn shop, ask the guy, give me the illegal stuff underneath the counter. He might say something. Then I had to walk out with like a film or a book, my wife, my kids, a friend, somebody might see it. I'd be in trouble. So I might never take those steps. Now I can go on the internet, type in, look whatever I want without somebody tracing me. And what we know about porn is the more you look, the more you need. And it actually starts to affect your brain chemistry and the way your brain works to where you need more and more. And one of the best indicators that somebody's a hands-on perpetrator is if they have child pornography on their computer. If they're looking at child porn, it is the #1 indicator somebody's a hands-on perpetrator. Because you will need more than that eventually. And so you go from watching, and some perps even said, I started looking at child porn to relieve myself, but as they masturbate to it, it actually makes them more needing it, and they have to up that, and then they go into a chat room just to talk to a kid, and then they ask to meet that kid, and suddenly they're stepping over lines even farther and farther. So we just know it makes it, and kids view the internet different than adults do. They are on it a lot more than the adults in charge most of the time of their lives. They view friends. Most adults still view friends as somebody they know in person, not somebody they only know over the internet. And kids don't see it that way. Child porn, I sort of get on my soapbox about this. We have a number of federal judges right now who are saying child porn is no big deal. Shouldn't be charged the same way as hands-on crime. Let's be clear what it is. It's child sex abuse images. It's images of humiliation, torture, and rape of a child. It's a crime scene photo that somebody's looking at. And talk to a kid who knows their porn picture is out there. And they will tell you it's like being raped every night of the week. They get to know every night of the week somebody is fantasizing about them in some horribly graphic position. They get to know that no matter how police try, they can never capture all those images. That they're out there the rest of their life. That their kids could see it. That their future husband could see it. That their parents could see it. And somebody wants to say that's not as bad. And if every time someone clicks on one child porn picture, they've told the pornographer, we need another. We need another. We need another. And we are now in Jeffco, we've had 2 cases already this year of dads who had no previous history, who we believe were making pornographic pictures of their own kids to get more porn. Because at these porn sites, they give you 10 pictures of kids, and then they cut you off. And if you want more, the only way you get more is by submitting a picture that is not already out on the web. And don't think they don't have them all categorized. And the only way you get a new one is by making one. And so they're creating guys to make them. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry, child porn. It is not some harmless crime. There is a victim every time you look at a picture. And that victim is re-victimized every night. And that the kids who get that, and as they get older, they get it more and more, live with that. And it's one of the worst things we have to say to a parent is, not only was your child molested, but we have to tell you there was a camera in the room and he took pictures. Let's talk about how you're going to deal with that on her wedding day when it shows up. Let's talk about it if it ever gets sent to your cell phone by some perv who thinks that would be really funny. It is horrific. So there's my soapbox. Don't let, when you hear somebody say it's no big deal, it's a big deal. It is torture of a kid. So what can you do as an agency? I do want to say we'll talk about some things, but remember, even as an agency, one person's fault. If you have somebody do something tomorrow, rape a kid here in your agency, and you worked right next to them, and there were signs you could have seen, and now looking back you think, oh, I should have done X, Y, and Z. Understand, learn from it, put in new policies, but understand it was that one person's fault. It was not your fault. Not saying you couldn't do better, not saying an agency couldn't do better, but understand they don't want you, they want you to be guilty. Because if you're guilty, you may think about not telling. An agency may think about not making it public, because they may take the guilt on as an agency. Remember whose fault it is. This person, you can make changes, you can be smarter, you can do all those things, but it's still one person's fault. Why is it important? One, you're in this job because you like kids and families, I'm guessing. You're here actually to make their life better. Having someone in your agency ever hurt a kid destroys you. Because the one thing you wanted to protect, you weren't able to protect. When we go into agencies where sometimes this has happened, they ask us to come in later and do trainings, I will tell you, it destroys the staff. It tears them apart because people start saying, I bet you he knew something about it. He worked shifts with them. Why didn't he ever say anything? Or why didn't administration put in more rules? Or why didn't that cottage follow those? Or why? People start going at each other. And then yourself, why didn't I? I worked shifts with him. I thought he was good. You know, that time I caught him out in the hallway, I thought it was no big deal. It'll tear your staff apart. It'll ruin the reputation. Maybe it isn't that one person. Maybe they got a whole bunch of perps out in that agency. I bet you that whole agency's into it. Nobody could have got away without them knowing. Everyone always can tell a perp. So they must have known. So I bet you half the staff out there are in on it. And financially, you're going to get sued. It's why we do a lot of training for churches in Jeffco, and I'd say the number one reason is their insurance told them to. Because churches are very vulnerable, and they can't get liability insurance a lot now without having training on sexual assault and perpetrators. So it starts at the hiring, and I know it starts by remembering nobody has the right. You can turn anybody down. There's no constitutional right to work with children. If you don't think they're perfect for children, don't hire them. And it starts with the application. You can start putting questions on the application besides your background. You can say, are you sexually attracted to your children? Have you ever done this? Are they going to answer those correctly? Probably not. If you got a real stupid one, that would be great, but probably not. But what it starts sending from immediately is that this is an organization that takes sexual abuse seriously. If I'm a perp and I'm looking for a place to work, and you're already asking questions on the application, I may think, this is not the place I want to work. They're overwrought about this. They're really looking at it. Background checks. These are good to do, but you're only going to catch the low-hanging fruit. Most perpetrators have not been caught. So you're only going to catch the guys who have already been caught. But I will say it's important. We had an agency recently who just didn't get around to doing that background check and had the guy tutoring kids for 6 months before they did that background check. By then he had already assaulted 4 kids, and he was a sexual perpetrator from New Mexico. They just hadn't gotten around to getting that paperwork in and getting it done in on time. And he is already getting to do his tutoring. Already hit 4 kids. They've already paid a major settlement besides everything else going on in the organization. But understand, it's good to do, but it's not a panacea. At Ralston House, we not only do background checks, we do a 21-page personal history we have to fill out with very personal questions. Then the police take that and polygraph us for 4 hours. And that's staff and volunteers. Why? Because we work with an incredibly vulnerable population, and we're part of an investigative team. It's miserable to go through. And even then, we have all sorts of safeguards because we still can't guarantee someone didn't pass the poly. They weren't able to lie through it. References, usually people aren't going to put bad ones, but you can ask questions like, how does this person relate to kids? Do they have a lot of adult friends or just kid friends? Would you trust this person with your kids? You may or may not get good answers to it, but sometimes you do. And again, references talk to the person they gave a reference for and say, boy, they asked a lot of questions about this. That starts sending the message. Interview questions. You can say, do you think sex abuse could ever happen here? What would you do if you saw it? How do you think you would report it? And you're not looking for necessarily a right answer. You're just looking to see how they would respond. It could never happen. I don't believe people do those things. That may not be the answer you want. Or, if they get really upset, why would you ask that kind of question? You're looking for reactions rather than necessarily right. And at the end of all our interviews, we're very clear. We're over crazy at Ralston House about protecting kids. We're going to nail you on every little boundary violation you make. We're going to bring it to your attention. And if that doesn't work for you, no hard feelings, you may not want to work here, that's great. Don't work here. I get that. It's not for everybody. But know if you do, that's your expectation coming in because we are serious about protecting kids from being re-assaulted while they're here at Ralston House. And we will do everything we can. So if that doesn't feel comfortable, don't come to work here. Boundaries are the number one things an agency can do. And they're the number one way employees push back or mess up without bad intent. It starts with a job description. What does your job description say? If your job description says you serve food in the cafeteria line, then you should not be tutoring a kid at night. That's not in your job description. And if you want to tutor kids at night, you should join a volunteer program that tutors kids at night. Because if you tutor kids at night from the same place you're serving food, those parents, those kids will think somehow the institution has backed you in that. And that there's training and there's safeguards in it. So what does your job description say? And stay within it. What's your rules about one-on-one time? And each agency will be different. And you've got to decide how you're going to handle it. If you have individual therapy, you have to have one-on-one time. But is it going to be in a room with a window? Is it going to be recorded? Is it, will you have somebody check in every 10 minutes? I don't know what your rules are going to be. But you want to be conscious of what those are and to follow them. I coach lacrosse, and we say we don't have one-on-one time with athletes outside of somebody's view. So if I need to correct a girl, she's been goofing off at practice, I don't have to yell at her in front of the whole team. But I don't also have to take her outside of the field. I can walk 10 yards away and have that conversation without being heard. I can still deal with her on a one-to-one basis, but not isolated, not one away from everybody else. Physical contact. Every agency is going to be different on that. On our lacrosse team, side hugs, high fives, knuckle bumps, a pat on the helmet for the goalie. Otherwise, we say we are not doing full hugs. And I'm a believer that teenage girls hug each other way too much all the time. So they don't need me adding to their hugging dilemma. But you can decide, daycare centers have to have more physical, they have to change diapers. But is somebody in the room watching that changing? What are your rules? Think about it and then hold to it. Personal, private, confidential conversations. As a parent, I don't want you having a conversation with my child that you can't tell me about. That doesn't mean you can't have a very intense conversation. Doesn't mean you can't do therapy, which would be confidential, but it means conversations as opposed to therapy. Talking about who they love, who they don't love, when that's not my role when they're at Ralston House. Or as a coach. I may give advice and say, you need to think about things, but I don't want to have personal and private conversations because that's out of my role. Favoritism, it works both ways. I may give favoritism so that I say to her, you want to start on the team and I'll carry your bag and stuff, and if you do X, Y, and Z, I can always guarantee that. Or I can be really mean to a kid and really nice to somebody else and say to the kid I'm being mean to, you see how Betty gets treated? Let me tell you how she gets that treatment. Here's how. By doing X, Y, and Z. If you do X, Y, and Z, you start to get that treatment too. So I may actually be mistreating the kid I'm trying to perp on, and the other one I'm setting up to train this one. So it can go both ways on favoritism. Relationships outside the role. What is your role? What's your relationship? We had a math teacher in Jeffco who, first day of class, asked all the kids, this was when MySpace was big instead of Facebook, said, I want everyone to put down their MySpace page because I'm going to go online and make sure you're not putting anything inappropriate. One parent called the high school and said, one kid came home, told their parent, one parent reported and said, why is a math teacher checking my kid's MySpace page? I can do that. I don't need them doing it. The school said, well, that's not a policy of ours. We'll look into it. They called the police. Police went and pulled up all these kids' MySpace pages. Amazingly enough, he hadn't talked to one of the boys. He'd only talked to the girls in the classroom. And not one conversation was about being inappropriate. It was all personal stuff. What did they like? What did they not like? Had he committed a crime? No. But we believe he is on his way to grooming. What the school was able to do then is say, no MySpace pages. If you do it again, we're going to take action. If it was an accident and it was truly just ignorance, then great. If you never do it again, you're not in trouble. There's no law here yet, but we believe that's where it was heading because he started a relationship outside of his role as teacher. His role was not to check kids' MySpace pages. Sexual conversations and jokes. I know this sounds, again, sort of ridiculous, but it is. We see it a lot with the high school level kids where coaches, teachers are just making sexual jokes. And kids react, that's the time they're testing out sexual jokes. So when I make the joke about a girl's bra filling out and she laughs, I could just be being stupid and making a dumb joke, or I could be testing it. Or when I tell boys, many male perps say the way they start grooming boys is they tell them sexual jokes. Not about boys, or they tell them about women. They're like, so there's two girls and we did this, because they're getting them sexualized. They want that conversation about sex to be with them and get them used to talking about sex. Then we can move on to other things. I can figure out how to manipulate you in other ways. Gifts and financial help. Often staff can want to help somebody, give them a gift. This John Candary, the guy I keep mentioning, when he went to these churches, he always went to mega churches because 500-600 people would come to these churches. And when you have that many people, you have a lot of cars. And he was a mechanic. And cars break down. And so people said later that John always had his tools with him, would go to auto parts stores and buy things for the cars and fix them right there in the church parking lot. And when people offered to pay, he said, no. Oh, come on, let me pay, John. No, just doing my good Christian duty. Oh, come on, let me pay. No. Oh, I got to be able to do something. Fine, invite me over for dinner sometime. And when they invited him over for dinner, they gave him the good seal of approval. Because my kids will tell you, I would never bring anyone in the house who would hurt them. Which means, by converse, I only bring in people they can trust. And so these families, out of the goodness of their heart, brought John in. And that's what financial gifts and help can lead to. If you're giving a kid money, if you're giving a family something, it makes them owing you. And if you're really serious about wanting to help them, talk to your agency about other ways. I know Johnny needs a mitt. In sports we see this, coaches giving gifts. I know Johnny needs a mitt. I want to donate $50 to, Ralston Valley Sports so Ralston Valley Sports can buy Johnny a gift. And I don't want him to know it comes from me. If you're really serious about helping Johnny, that's all you need to do. You can figure out other ways. But if I want to make sure the family knows it was me, if I want to get that credit and I want them to owe me, then I may not do it that way. Photos and videos. The parent who's always taking photos of the girls, always asking them to model, do things. What are your rules as an organization about what videos or photos you can take? There are appropriate times. A birthday party, some special occasion. That's fine, but when is it every day in the dorm somebody's taking photos as kids? And it's important for the agency to give you positive ways of doing this. They can't, it's not good to say no one-on-one time, no physical contact, and no gifts or financial help ever. What's going to happen is people are going to break the rules because you've given people no way to express themselves and do things. You've got to turn around and say, we don't want one-on-one time where you're in a hallway or a dark closet by yourself. But here's the way, if you need to correct a kid one-on-one, you could go about doing it. We do not want somebody putting a 16-year-old girl on their lap and holding them as a way of saying, good job. But A high five is great. A note saying, great job today on working out your problems, that is put up on a bulletin board for everyone to see that you're praising that kid. There are different ways you can do these kind of things without saying none of it. Because if you say none, people will violate the boundaries. And it's important to maintain your boundaries and to have them reasonable. What has to happen is the boundaries have to be clear. It just can't be, and we see agencies like this, all right, no touching. Well, what if somebody falls down and hurts themselves? Well, you can touch them then. Well, what if they get some all over them? Can I reach across and wipe it off? Yeah, you can do that. Now that there's no rule there. And when the person starts breaking it, they can say, well, I didn't know you let us do this. So you want to try to make them as clear as you can. And don't tolerate minor violations. Because what we see at agencies when we go in later is many times a perp has 10, 20, 30 minor violations, but everyone's tolerated and nobody's noticed it. So you saw me take a girl into the bathroom alone. You saw me doing a frontal hug with the girl, no big deal. You saw me take a girl down the hall and meet with them alone. Somebody else saw me give a gift. And it was just one time, and it was just minor. But when we go in later and people are sitting around talking about what happened, we see violation after violation after violation. And because it was minor, nobody ever wrote it down, nobody ever paid attention. So we say, don't tolerate minor. You say, you know what? You're not supposed to take kids in the hall to correct them. You took them in the hall. I'm going to leave and have to let our supervisor know about it. It's part of what we do here to keep us all safe. And then somebody should write it down. The supervisor should write it down and keep a log. Because again, if you're just hearing it, you may not put it together. But when you see a log of violations, or when you're doing these, what we call post-mortems on agencies that have had an accusation made, and you see, when they're now talking and you see 40 violations that everyone thought was just one or two, it looks completely different. So you want to start documenting those, and you want to address those in supervision, and you want to remember that perps will try to get you to violate boundaries. Because if we're all violating them, we can't tell. And I will be the guy who says, I know we're not supposed to give kids personal cards, but, you know, Betty just needs it. And I know you want to give Mark one, so you go ahead and give Mark one. I'll give Betty one. We don't need to let anybody know. And you're giving Mark one because you really want to do the right thing. And I'm getting Betty one because I want to assault her. And I want to start developing that relationship. But once you gave Mark one, you can't tell anyone about me giving Betty one. And I'll keep you trying to violate those boundaries. I'll try to push you farther, and I'll talk about how admin doesn't understand us or the other staff don't understand. We're the only ones who get these kids, because I want you to join in with me. Because if we can get boundaries being broken everywhere, then you can't tell the people who are serious about keeping kids safe and the ones who are breaking boundaries because they want to hurt kids. And it's important, too, that staff, that you don't overreact to all these. As one thing, so as a supervisor, you want to make sure you're not firing somebody for the first time they break a boundary. And you don't want to overreact as other staff. I'm going to tell, I believe it was an accident, no big deal. But we're going to document it. We had a staff at a volunteer, great volunteer, still with us, but she made a mistake right in front of all of us. And I believe there's nothing wrong. We never say something like, I love you to a kid. We see them for a couple hours for an interview, then they're out. But as this kid, our victim advocate volunteer, had been with this kid for about 3 hours during the time while her siblings were getting interviewed. And when the kid was walking out the door, she turned around and said, I love you, Betty. And Betty said, love you too. And then she stopped and looked at all the rest of us and we're like, yep, you shouldn't have said that. She's like, I know, I'm sorry. And I'm like, all right, no big deal. We'll write it down. Just don't let it happen again. We were done with it. I wasn't going to fire her for that. I don't believe there was malintent, but we did write it down in her file. Because if it kept happening, then we would have a different conversation. So supervisors have to be reasonable about this. And it's important for you as staff to let people correct you. And that's the hardest thing. When you violate a boundary, when you do something that you shouldn't do by accident, and somebody says, I need to tell so-and-so, and you say, oh, don't tell, you're creating an environment that a perpetrator wants. When you get mad at another staff and say, God, I didn't tell the time you did that, or I don't tell. Now you're going to tell me the one time I do something wrong? You're creating an environment for a perpetrator to manipulate you, even though your intent. You have to be, thanks. I'm glad you caught me. I won't do it again. And do let her know, and I'll talk to her about it in supervision too. That was really stupid. Welcome it. And I know it's hard. I don't like being corrected. I understand that. But welcome it, because it's the only way you keep perps out. Because they want you not to tell. And supervisors react appropriately. If it was a one-time thing, it's okay. And think about, why do people violate boundaries? There's 3 reasons, I believe. 1, it's somebody who's incompetent. You've told them there are no frontal hugs. And they hug somebody on the front, you say, don't do that. They hug again, they don't do it. And you really don't believe they're doing it to be malicious? They just can't understand, the words. So they're incompetent if they can't follow your boundaries, and that's their intent. You don't want incompetent people working for you. Get rid of them. 2, they're insubordinate. They understand there's rules here. They understand you've agreed to follow them. You've taken the employment. You've said, I'm going to do this. I imagine you have team meetings where you can argue about rules and say, can we look at changing this? But they've decided they don't agree with it. And if they don't agree, they get to do what they want. Because they're insubordinate. You don't want insubordinate people working with you. If you don't like a rule, either leave the agency or work to change it. But to work inside the agency and continue to fight a rule that you know is part of the agency is dishonest. Change it. Know that you lose sometimes, that you don't get your way every time, or leave the agency. Or, if they're not insubordinate, if they're not incompetent, then they've got ulterior motives, which aren't good. Because that's really it. Otherwise, you can follow boundaries with an occasional slip-up. Physical environment, I don't expect somebody to build a new facility, and put in windows where you don't have windows, but just know what your vulnerabilities are. Know this is a bad hallway. Know that corner down there is not someplace you ever want to have kids because you can't be seen. Know that the dining room at night there's a bad corner there. Know your vulnerabilities and address them. Say, we don't go in this area without other staff, because nobody else could hear or see you if you were there. If you have the money to make changes, like to put little windows in a room like this, that's terrific. But if you don't, you make best do and just know where your vulnerabilities are. Reporting, most of you are probably, I'm guessing, mandatory reporters, so it's no big deal. But what to report? We believe it's every adult's responsibility. Obviously, abuse. Report boundary violations. And report confusing or concerning behavior. And this doesn't mean you're accusing anybody of something. But we've had groups that said, I just didn't feel right when he was around the girls in the preschool area. There's nothing I could put on it. And then when you go back in, 5 people say that. And maybe if one person had gone to supervisor and say, I don't know about you, but every time John is working the night shift, I find him, I don't know, it just is a weird vibe I get. Do you get that? They may say, no, I've never heard anything like that. Get over it. Or they may say, you know what, you're the 4th person who came to me with that. Maybe there's something more we need to look at. I tell this story, my oldest daughter, Katie, who's now 27, and she does not remember that. When she was 3, we went to my work, where I was working at that time. Took her in. I had to pick up some papers, and we were going to another friend's house. My wife and I are with her. She's between us as we're walking out. A guy who just started there bent down and said hi. Katie was one of those huggy ones. She ran right. My wife is there. I'm here. She's here. He bends down. She grabs him like that for 1 second. Let's go. We go back to the car. We get in the car seat. 15 minutes later, she says, I don't want to hug that guy anymore. I say, what? I don't want to hug that guy anymore. I said, well, that's fine. You'll probably never see him again. I really didn't think any more about it. 6 months later, he was charged with child molestation and later convicted. I do not know what she felt. To this day, she'll tell you she doesn't remember it. My wife and I were both there. There's no way he grabbed her or did anything. But she got some feeling. And we know, now that we do more brain studies, we know there is a primitive part of our brain that recognizes things our conscious brain doesn't recognize. They use this with SWAT teams. If guys come into a SWAT situation too high in our vat on their SWAT team, they take a paintball gun and at close range just nail them without any padding on. And it leaves big welts and it hurts. Eventually, what happens is when they hit that situation, their body ducks and they go to a certain level without thinking. Because their primitive brain says, dang, this is when we get hit with those paintballs and it really hurts. And they don't even recognize it. They'll tell you, I don't know why I ducked all of a sudden. But it's the same situation. Our primitive brain recognizes danger before we do. Often those feelings of, I don't get it, it means you are seeing something, but you're not processing it. And sometimes talking to somebody else, they've seen something. And when it's like, all right, now it makes sense. If it doesn't, you haven't, I'm not saying accuse anybody, just understand that it may be there. Talk to the kids and families about what your rules are. You don't have to give them the big manual that you have, but you can say basic rules. No staff should ever frontal hug you. No staff should ever take you alone. No staff, and we want you to tell us if that ever happens, because we want to make sure we're all following the rules. Families, no staff who works here in one of the units should ever be visiting your kids on the weekend. If you don't tell them the rules, then who's going to report? You think the staff's going to come back? Just so you know, I was visiting the family on the weekend violating our boundaries. They're not going to tell you. But we know kids love to tell on staff. Sooner or later, every staff who does something a little, even if it's generous, will get a kid telling on them. They just love it. So tell them the rules, and then they can help you be your boundary monitors. Trust your intuition, which is just what I was saying about if you feel something, talk to somebody. Don't ignore it. I will often say you all are our first line of defense when there is a report. You're what we call the outcry witness in court. And juries listen to you better than they listen to anyone else. Because you don't have a dog in the fight is what they believe. Or else now they're going to accuse us of trying to convince kids, manipulate them. Police just want to put, innocent people in jail. Everybody else is out to get the guy. But outcry witnesses, they have a hard time arguing that. So when you hear people say, well, what do I do? How do I respond? The main thing is understand the dumber you are, the better you are at responding to outcries, I believe. Don't try to be smart, because being smart gets us in trouble in this case. All we want you to do is listen. Listen to what they have to say. Don't ask questions. Just listen. Observe how they're saying it. Were they laughing? Were they crying? Were they telling another girl in the unit about, does your dad ever come in at night and do this to you? What were they doing? Observe how they told you and what they said. Believe, no matter how crazy it sounds at the time, just for that moment, believe. Because kids will know whether you're believing them or not. It doesn't mean you can't change your mind later. And it doesn't mean no matter how fantastical it is. And I'll give you an example that's used nationally. We've seen others at ours, but this is such a classic one. Kid is in a forensic interview, gives a 5-year-old gives a very graphic description of being sexually assaulted by about a 30-year-old male. Police are like watching this interview in the observation room thinking, oh, we nailing this guy. At the end of the interview, kid's like, oh, one more thing. When I was molested, a giant eagle grabbed me in its claws and held me in the air the whole time. Police were like, dang, there went our case. How are you going to take that in front of a jury? They're going to say this kid's making it up, an imagination, all that. But what the police did, and what we tell our officers all the time is, believe them for now. Do what a good investigator does, investigate it. Look for the giant eagle, in other words. So what they did is, what they normally do is, we have a guy who says he's perp, we're going to go try to get in his house, seize any kind of clothes, maybe a computer, find pictures, so they do that. When they go in the perpetrator's bedroom, where the perp said the kid had never been in his house, his bedspread is a giant eagle with its claws out. When the kid was laying face down on that bed, that's what he saw. And for a 5-year-old, it makes sense. It ended up being the key piece of evidence because, one, the guy said he'd never been in his house, and two, the jury got it. That made sense to him. But it was fantastical. It couldn't happen. But they believed. So just at that moment, believe. Write it down. You won't be called to court for 1.5 to 2 years. Document it. The kid told me this, I said that, they were crying, blah, blah, blah. Thank the kid. Say, thank you for telling me, and report. And I don't know here, I know in Jeffco, we know every agency has a way of reporting. Like you tell your supervisor, they tell they're going. But what we say to frontline workers is, we will come after you, and we have in Jeffco, if you do not make sure your supervisor report. If you just turn around and say, This kid told me they were abused, and you turn away, and you don't ask them who they reported to, when they reported, and can I have a copy of your report? Can I see a copy? If you don't do that and they don't report, we'll hold you responsible. And again, I don't know how they do it out on this side of town, because we're saying you're obligated to make sure. Now, if they say, yes, I called Susie at Social Services on July 10th at 2 o'clock, and they lie to you, you're off the hook. But just turning and never asking again, we're saying that's not good enough. You need to say, I want to know when you report, and I want you to report back to me that you reported. And if they didn't, go to somebody else and say, I told Susie about this. She's never told me she reported. I'd like to know whether it was reported or not. Because what we know is agencies can sometimes want to protect their own. Or they don't believe because it's fantastical. And that's not their decision. It's an investigator's decision. And you don't want to be the one to think later on, I could have followed it up a little bit more, and I didn't. And this guy stayed in our agency and hurt more and more kids. I'll tell you, that's a sick feeling at the pit of your stomach. What we don't want you to do is don't panic, because all you have to do is listen. Don't question. The kid says, my dad had sex with me. Don't say, was it intercourse, oral? That's all you need. Because what will happen is the defense attorney will turn that around. And we had a deputy do this in Jeffco by accident. Because usually detectives do the questioning initially before they get him in their Ralston house. And this kid said to the deputy, my dad has sex with me. And he said, oral sex, anal sex, listed them all off. And she said, yes, yes, yes. When it got to court, the defense attorney said, so she never said those words. Isn't that correct? Well, yeah. All she said was sex, right? Yeah. Well, in their family, sex is patting each other on the butt. It's a little joke they have. All his testimony got thrown out because they said he was leading. So it's not up to you to investigate. If you have, the law says if you suspect. If a kid has told you enough to suspect, then they'll get into a Ralston house, or here it's Sungate Kids, and they'll do the interview out there. But the more questions you ask, the more you can contaminate an interview. Training, what we're doing today, you have to train on this, and it should happen at least annually. If you tell people at orientation, we're really serious about sexual abuse, and here's the things you need to do, and then they work here 6 years and they never hear it again, how serious are you? Not very. Once a year, you have to bring it up. You have to talk about sex abuse. And here's why. If you don't train on it, we all become complacent. All of us. I include myself in this. We will start to forget, and we'll start to believe instead that kids will tell, that we can tell about perps, and that it doesn't happen here. None of us want to believe it happens in our agency. None of us want to believe the people we work with could possibly be capable of this. And that's why you train, to remind you that kids don't tell, that we can't tell if somebody's a perpetrator, and that it can happen here. And it's one of those things psychologically you don't want to think about sex abuse. I get that. I always say when I go out to a party and people say, what do? I say I work at a small nonprofit. And I try to leave the conversation there and move on to something else. Because if I say I work at a small nonprofit and we talk about sex abuse all day, child sex abuse, I'm drinking in the corner alone. And I don't want that. So I get that it's not fun to talk about, but that's why you have to train on it yearly and bring it up, at least yearly. And finally, if something happens here, remember, it's one person's fault. It's the perps. You can, again, look at what you can do better. You can think as an agency, how could we handle it? But understand it's one person's fault. It's the one who does it. I want to, and I'll hand out the PowerPoint and everything, but I do want to say this is some books you can read on this. The one I'd just like to give a little bit of warning about is this predators, pedophiles, rapists, and other sex offenders. It is very graphic. My staff who listen to this, I mean, I have forensic interviewers who do 4 or 5 interviews a day, and it grosses them out. Just so, it's very, very well researched, it's well written, but it is very graphic. The rest are not. The gift of fear and protecting the gift are not necessarily about sex abuse. They're about recognizing your instincts, understanding somewhat how the brain works and how our primitive brain does pick up on things we often don't. Protecting the gift's about how to keep kids safe. The gift of fear is for anybody, just to say, use the gift you've been given of fear, and it'll make you actually stronger and less fearful. I finally want to end just with reporting is hard, talking about this subject's hard, reporting other people on boundaries and following boundaries are hard. I give my one example to say, be as strong as a 5-year-old. We had a 5-year-old girl come in. Her dad had been molesting her for a number of years, at 5 already. Made a mistake and grabbed a kid in the park. This kid asked him to help. This little girl asked him to help her. And when he got next to her, he reacted to his impulses and grabbed her. And she screamed, and he ran, and the police were able to track down where he went. So when they found out this guy had a daughter, they bring his daughter in to interview, because we're always going to, any kids the perps have touched have been around. We interview his daughter. His daughter says, "Can I tell you everything here?" We say, "Yeah," and she goes into great detail of what he did to her. And then the interviewer, after she gets all that, says, "I want you to tell me about the other kids who come and play at your house, because we're concerned how many other kids is he molesting in this neighborhood." And she says, "Oh no, I don't let kids come to my house. I can't let my dad do that to him." 5 years old, she's protecting the other kids in her neighborhood. If you find reporting hard or telling someone they violated a boundary, think about this 5-year-old. I have something I hang on my bulletin board that when I have a hard time making a decision, not wanting to confront an officer about something or do something hard, I think about her. 5 years old, she's taking it every night, and she's protecting the other kids in her neighborhood. She needed an adult to step up for her. And you're in those positions. When you decided to work here, you put a big responsibility on your shoulders. I worked residential, and I don't ever want to go back. Not because it's not valuable, but because it is hard. My job is much easier now. But the fact is, you put it on your shoulders. You can make a decision not to work these kind of jobs. If you work with kids, you take on the responsibility of addressing other people's boundary violations, of reporting and doing the right thing. And if you don't want it, walk away. But for you, those who choose it every day, I mean, I really thank you for the work you do, and it makes our job great. And I know the kids, we see a lot of times the front end, you guys are seeing the back end of what happens to kids who don't get in and tell and don't get the treatment. We really appreciate the work you do here, and I really appreciate you having to listen to this for 2 hours on a nice sunny day instead of having to listen about child sex abuse. So I'd open up to any questions you might have. What? Statistically, they're assaulted more, but they report less, is what we know. And we do see that. We also do interviews with developmentally disabled adults who are over 18, but operating at maybe a 3rd, 4th grade level. Because again, they're going to be very vulnerable. They have people who are entrusted with their care, and many of them have difficulty talking or being able to express what happened to them. So they're a prime target for perpetrators. Unfortunately, they're probably the most underreported category of kids, is kids who are developmentally disabled or severely physically handicapped. Anything else? Well, thank you all very much. And I was going to say, here is the PowerPoint if you'd like that, and some information on Ralston House.